Okay, so now we're going to move on to talking about the myths of origins in Buddhism. And for this slide, we're going to talk about the life story of the Buddha. So in our last slide, we went through some of the just sort of general highlights of the life of Siddhartha Gautama. But there is much more to his life story within Buddhism. And a lot of the understandings of Buddhism are inspired by the life story of the Buddha. So what happens to him and how he achieves enlightenment are very important keys to understanding the tradition of Buddhism. So we're going to go over some of the major factors of his life story, of his childhood, as well as how he becomes enlightened. So I have here the story of the Enlightenment. So, as I said before, Siddhartha Gautama was a prince. He was a prince of a small kingdom in northern India. And he was quite wealthy. So he did come from a wealthy family because he was a prince. So his dad was a king and his mother was a queen. But he wasn't like the prince of all of India. India was not a united country at this time. So his family just kind of had this small kingdom. Which would be like, you could say similar to, being the son of a governor today, something like that. So yes, he was born with money and power, but not like the prince of all of Asia, or sorry, all of India. So when he was born, his son is born to a king and a queen. It's a time for great celebration. So when he was born, according to the stories about the Buddha's life, and you're going to read some of these in your required World's Wisdom texts, they had a big party. They invited, all the people of the kingdom to come and help them celebrate the birth of a baby boy. And everyone brought gifts, right? Everyone brought gifts to celebrate the baby. But there was an old man who came to the party. He was an old, wise man. And he didn't have a gift to give. But he said, instead of a gift, I will give you a prophecy. I am a wise and holy man. I can see into the future, and I know the destiny of your child. I know the destiny of your son. And so he told Siddhartha's parents that their son was destined to become a great man. He was destined to do great things in this world. But he said, there are two possible paths that your son will go down. If he embraces the world, if he loves the world, he will become a great warrior and a great conqueror, and he will unite all of India and become the king of India. He said that's one possible path that your son will go down. The other path is if he rejects the world, if he becomes disillusioned with the world, he will become a great holy man and he will become the savior of the world. So this was the prophecy that was given at Siddhartha Gautama's birth. The parents believed it, and you can probably guess which one Siddhartha's father especially wanted him to go down. Right? Remember, this is a Kshatriya family. They're from the warrior caste, and his father is a king. So his father, of course, wants Siddhartha to become the warrior, right? To become the great conqueror, to unite all of India and become the king of India. This would be a great thing to happen for his son. So he decides that he has to keep his son in love with the world, right? Because the prophecy was, if he embraces the world, if he loves the world, then he will conquer it. So the father puts this plan in place that he wants to make sure that Siddhartha Gautama never becomes disillusioned with the world. So he tries to keep him from seeing any form of suffering. So Siddhartha Gautama grows up in really the lap of luxury, and that's the next point that I have down here. His early life, his childhood, and his life as a young man is one of constant pleasure, right? And his parents are wealthy, so they can provide this for him. So anything that he wants, he is able to have. Right? He can eat the finest food. He can wear the finest clothes. They pay people to come and entertain him. They can bring musicians to come, bring dancers to come. And all sights of sadness and suffering are kept from Siddhartha. So he is not allowed to see sickness. He is not allowed to see old age. He is not allowed to see poverty. He is not allowed to see anyone being sad. And this works. This works for a long time. Siddhartha Gautama is incredibly happy. He leads this life of complete and pure pleasure, and he doesn't know that there is any sadness or suffering in the world. Part of this deal is that Siddhartha Gautama is not allowed to leave the palace grounds, right? The only way his father can control what he sees is to make sure that he stays within the palace grounds. And Siddhartha Gautama has no reason to want to leave the palace grounds. He has everything there he could ever want. His father, when he becomes a young man, his father brings him all the women that he wants. And then when he's ready to get married, they bring him a beautiful bride for him to marry. So as a young man, he does get married. It's an arranged marriage because this is, an ancient Indian society. So it's an arranged marriage, but according to the stories, he does actually fall in love with his wife. He falls deeply in love with his wife. They are madly in love with each other. She becomes pregnant. They have a son together. He is perfectly happy. Everything is wonderful. His life is wonderful. He has, nothing but pleasure, nothing but joy, nothing but happiness. But of course, he starts to wonder. He starts to question what is outside of the palace grounds. I want to go and see what's outside of the palace grounds. So according to the stories about the Buddha's life, when he is about 29 years old, he asks his chauffeur, he asks his driver, and that's what this image is here behind me, to sneak him out of the palace. He wants to go out into the city, into the town, and see what life is like outside of the palace. So the driver says, sure, right, I'll take you out, I'll sneak you out. And while he's out, he goes out on 4 different trips, and on those 4 trips, he sees 4 different things. And those 4 things are called the 4 sights in Buddhism. And the image behind me is a sort of a painting that depicts the 4 sights. So the first time he goes out, he sees an old man. And this is not just, somebody in their 50s or their 60s who's starting to get a little bit older. He sees somebody who is really quite elderly, right? Somebody who is hunched over from old age. Their body is decrepit. It's hard for them to walk. So he sees really the ravages of old age, of what aging does to a human body. And he's never seen this before. He's been kept from all sights like this his entire life. So he's honestly confused. He doesn't understand what he's seeing. So he asks his driver, what's wrong with that man? Why does that man look so different from us? And the driver says, well, there's nothing wrong with him. He's just old. That's what happens to everyone. We're young now, but eventually we get old, and that's what happens to our bodies. And Siddhartha Gautama is shocked by this. He had no idea. He's only 29 years old. He had no idea that that was the destiny of the human body, that the human body, develops and grows until a certain point, and then we start to age, it starts to decay, and it starts to deteriorate. So he's really shaken by this sight. He's really shaken by this knowledge that human beings age, and they can age so extremely like this. So he goes home, but he asks his driver a second time, right, I want you to sneak me out, I want to see more. And the second time he sees a sick man. And again, not just, somebody with a cold or somebody slightly under the weather. He sees somebody who is quite ill. According to the stories, this person is, coughing up blood. They're pale, they're sweating, they're obviously quite ill. And again, Siddhartha Gautama has never seen this before. He doesn't know what's happening to this person's body. He asks his driver, what's wrong with that man? And his driver says, well, he's sick. He has an illness. We're healthy right now, but at some point in our lives, we're going to get sick. And the same thing's going to happen to most people that we know. We're going to go through these times of illness. Again, Siddhartha Gautama had no idea that this was what happens to people. Whenever someone was sick, his dad would, usher them away. You're not allowed to be in my son's presence. So again, he's shaken. He's shocked. He's depressed. He didn't know that this is what human life has in it. This is what is in the course of every human life. Goes home, asks his driver a third time to take him out. And on that trip, he sees a corpse. He sees a dead body. And again, he's never seen this before. He asks his driver, what's wrong with that man? And this time the driver says, well, there's nothing wrong with him now. He's dead. This is what happens to everyone. We all die. And Siddhartha Gautama is really upset by this, right? He's really shocked and shaken to the core by seeing this. He did not know that human beings die. He did not know that the destiny of every person is death. And we talked about this when we were going through Hinduism, right? That Hinduism understands the course of any life in samsara to be marked by more suffering than joy because of these factors, right? Old age, sickness, and death. It doesn't just happen to us, it happens to everyone that we love as well. So these truths about life in samsara carry over into Buddhism. But they're understood to have especially affected Siddhartha Gautama because he learned about this all at once, right? We know all these things already, right? We know that we get old, we know that we get sick, and we know that we die. But we were introduced to these truths very, very slowly and very carefully by our parents, right? You don't just tell a child right away, by the way, you're going to get old, you're going to get sick, and you're going to die, right? We don't do that to children because we know that this is a hard truth. This is something that is not easy to understand, and it's not easy to live with. So we kind of slowly build up to this understanding as children grow up. But Siddhartha Gautama found all this out in the matter of a couple of days, and he couldn't handle it. He just can't handle that this is what life is about. So all of us have kind of learned to make peace with this fact, right? We still go on in our daily lives. We know in the back of our minds that at any time we could get sick, at any time we could die, and that with each passing day, we're getting older and older. We're going through the processes of changing of aging. But we know how to get through this. We found a way to, still get up in the morning, right? To still live our lives, even though we know that we could die today. We know that today could be our last day. But because Siddhartha Gautama was introduced to these truths so quickly, he really can't handle it. He cannot find that peace. So he becomes depressed after seeing these things. These three sites at first. He becomes depressed and he can't understand why how people are able to just go about their lives, falling in love and, holding down jobs and going to birthday parties and doing all these normal things when in the back of their minds they know that they're going to get old, they're going to get sick, and they're going to die. He hasn't figured this out of how we sort of just learn to live with these things, knowing that we are bound to suffer at some point in our futures. So he can't find any joy in life anymore. His entire life of pleasure has become unraveled. He can find no joy in his wealth, in his fine food, in his fine clothes, in his wife, in his baby son. He can't find joy in those things, knowing that ultimately they're not going to last forever, right? They're going to go away. He's going to get old, he's going to get sick, and he's going to die, and the same thing's going to happen to everyone that he loves. So he asks his driver to take him out a fourth time. And on the fourth time, he sees a Hindu sannyasi or sadhu, right? That's the fourth picture here right behind me. He sees a Hindu holy man. And the holy man is wearing the robes, and he's sitting by the side of the road, and he's meditating. And Siddhartha Gautama asks his driver, who is that man? What is that man doing? And he says, well, that's a holy man. He has abandoned the world, or he has renounced the world, so that he can overcome suffering, so that he can achieve liberation. And Siddhartha Gautama, of course, looks at that man and says, that's what I need to do. Right? I can no longer live my life as this rich prince with a wife and a child when I can find no joy in any of these things anymore. So he decides that he has to go out and he has to find a way to overcome suffering. He has to find a way to find joy in life, even though we know all of these sources of suffering are coming, that they are a part of life as well. So this is what motivates him to leave home. So after he sees these four sites, when he's 29 years old, he runs away, basically. He leaves in the middle of the night. He leaves his family, his palace, his kingdom, his wife, his son, and he goes out into the woods. Right? He takes off his fancy clothes. According to the stories, he cuts his hair. He shaves his head to be like a Hindu holy man, and he embarks on a life of homelessness and meditation and intense study from other teachers to try to overcome suffering. So this is what sets him out on the path to try to achieve enlightenment. So we'll talk more about when he achieves it and how he achieves it, but this is the story of what brought him to the point where he knows that he must find this. He cannot continue to live the same type of life that he did before. So that's the first part of the story of Siddhartha Gautama, and we're going to continue that on when we talk about historical myths and myths of endings. But in terms of the other part of the myths of origins, right, the origin of the world or the origin of the universe, Buddhism doesn't have one. So I have here no origin story. In Buddhism, there is no story about how the world began. There is no story about how the universe began. There is no God who created the world, who sort of put the processes of the world or the universe in place. It's just here. It just is. So the Buddha was not interested in metaphysical questions. He was not interested in talking about how the world began, what the world is made of, etc., etc. He was really focused on understanding suffering and how to overcome suffering. So when people would ask him about the origin of the world, he would say, "Why are you so concerned about that? Right? That's not what I'm here to teach you. I'm simply here to teach you how to overcome suffering." And the Buddha actually taught that focusing too much on the origin of the world is a distraction, that nobody was there when it started, so no one's ever going to know for sure exactly what happened. All we are ever going to have are theories about the beginning of the world. And since no one's ever going to know for sure, there's always going to be multiple theories, and people are always going to argue about those theories. So he told his followers, don't get bogged down in those debates and those fights about how the origin, or how the world started, what the origin of the world is. Don't worry about that, right? Focus on your path to overcoming suffering. Don't get distracted by those fights and those debates. So he actually thought focusing too much on an origin story was a source of distraction that's not going to help you. It's not going to help you to overcome suffering. Okay, so that's all we have for myths of origins, and then next we're going to move on to historical myths, and we'll pick up the story of the life of the Buddha.